She'd been on her feet since dawn, when the highway turned gold, when coffee hissed like steam from a comet's tail, and the first rigs ghosted past the diner windows. Sorrel Aiden stacked plates along her forearm like a card-sharp shuffling luck, moving in a rhythm that kept tips predictable and emotions corralled. She told herself comfort was a system. Coffee poured before anyone had to ask, napkins folded into triangles sharp enough to pry open a day, pie slices cut into metaphors you could eat. What she never admitted was that this ritual was the only thing keeping the soft parts of her life from spilling everywhere. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The trucker came in at 9:13 a.m., exactly 2 minutes after Sorrel had wiped the last sugar ring off table 7. He was tall in that elevator frame way some drivers were, built to haul silence and miles, with a stillness that made noise remember its manners. He didn't remove his cap, didn't play with his phone, didn't ask for anything he didn't need. At first glance, he was just another pilgrim of asphalt, road in his shoulders, night grit at the corners of his eyes. But when he looked up, really looked, Sorrel felt the unexpected sensation of an elevator cable tightening inside her chest. "Coffee?" she asked, pen hovering. Her voice landed in that steady middle place she used when men decided the menu was her smile. "Black," he said. "No sugar. No negotiating." His words were soft, but they didn't see any reason to apologize for taking up space. On the pad she wrote B, had done so 10,000 times. But next to the letters she drew a tiny dot she'd never drawn before, a star too small for even her to notice later. Sorrel returned with coffee and a glass of water, because people who said they wanted nothing often meant they needed 2 things. He cradled the cup in both hands like it was winter, and the heat might teach his skin a language he'd nearly forgotten. "Anything else for you?" she asked. He turned the laminated menu over once without reading it. "You tell me," he said, not unkindly. "What's good when you have to get to California before midnight, but feel like it's still yesterday everywhere you go?" "Pie," she said, "and something with protein." She recommended the skillet with extra onions and the kind of potatoes that felt like they were stitched together from memory. He nodded. Sorrel wrote down what he never actually asked for and added an extra egg without charging for it. She didn't know why her hand did that. It simply did. While the cook, Beryl with the eagle tattoo, moved pans like she was conducting a thunderstorm, Sorrel topped off coffee and let her attention slide around the room like a steady tide. The 2 linemen at the counter were already 3 stories deep into the world's most complicated ladder mishap. A mother was bargaining with a toddler over the concept of crust. In the corner, a man in a suit kept his briefcase between his feet, one hand draped over it the way people hold whatever they're terrified to lose. When the skillet was ready, Sorrel carried it the way she carried almost everything that mattered. Invisible balancing act, smile on. She set it down. The trucker, name still a blank in her mind, nodded a thanks he made with his whole face. He ate like someone who had to meet hunger halfway most of his life. Not greedy, just precise. It occurred to her that precision is what you practice when you don't trust the world to keep feeding you. Between refills, she asked what she always asked the ones who looked like they'd forgotten how to speak to anyone not printed on road signs. "You heading far?" He considered the window instead of her. He said after a beat, "Far is a feeling. I'm heading west." "West is a feeling too," she said before she could help it. He smiled at the window's reflection, which was the kind of thing that should have irritated her and didn't. When the check came, he pulled out cash, crisp, folded like something a careful person did, and left more than the total. He stood, adjusted the brim of his cap, and Sorrel had the strange urge to tell him to wait, to say something simple that would tether this moment to something other than the scattered yards of highway waiting to swallow him. "I packed some extra rolls," she said instead, surprising herself, "and a couple apples. Long day." From beneath the counter, she produced a paper bag she hadn't prepared for anyone else. He blinked. For a second, it seemed like he couldn't remember the right word for gratitude,
And when he did, it sounded better for having been found. "That's kind," he said. "Then, what's your name?" "Sorrel," she said, and her own name felt like a truth. She was finally saying to the right witness. He hesitated, then offered, "Calder." The name fit him like a road fits a map. Inevitable. A little lonely. "You have a good day, Sorrel." He tucked the bag under his arm with more care than the average person gave to glass. When the bell above the door tapped its small brass applause, he was gone. She didn't see which rig he climbed into. The breakfast rush surged, and the rhythm took her again. But every time the bell above the door sang for someone else, a part of her lifted its head, as if returning to the edge of a dream. By noon, the light shifted into that pale geometry that made everything look like it had come to terms with its shapes. Sorrel rolled silverware, crumpled order chits into a nest inside her apron pocket, and took stock of the gentle wreckage the day always left behind. Calder had said "west," like he was measuring the word before paying for it. She told herself to stop thinking about a man whose inventory of words fit in a coffee cup and a long-haul map. The paper bag under the counter, the twin to the one she'd handed him, was something she'd packed without intending to do. She didn't need it now. On a whim, she carried it out to the alley behind the diner, where a pair of black-eyed cats had been negotiating with the dumpster all week. She tore one roll in half, and the cats approached, calculating. "Careful," she said to them, and for a moment wondered who she meant. When her shift ended, the light had fallen down the sky to its more interesting angles. Sorrel rolled silverware, crumpled rudderchits into a nest inside her apron pocket, and took stock of the gentle wreckage the day always left behind. Calder had said "west," like he was measuring the word before paying for it. She told herself to stop thinking about a man whose inventory of words fit in a coffee cup and a long-haul map. The paper bag under the counter, the twin to the one she'd handed him, was something she'd packed without intending to do. She didn't need it now. On a whim, she carried it out to the alley behind the diner, where a pair of black-eyed cats had been negotiating with the dumpster all week. She tore one roll in half, and the cats approached, calculating. "Careful," she said to them, and for a moment wondered who she meant. When her shift ended, the light had fallen down the sky to its more interesting angles. Sorrel tucked tips into a jar she kept inside a cereal box, a habit she'd picked up from a roommate who never trusted banks, pulled on a jacket with a seam she'd repaired twice, and stepped out into the brief theater of evening, when the highway's noise softened and you could hear your own thoughts long enough to decide whether to invite them in for tea. Her apartment was 4 blocks away in a building that had once believed it was fancy and had since made peace with decency. The stairs creaked like a chorus that knew more verses than anyone wanted to hear. The landlord, a retired band teacher named Mr. Baines, had hung a fern on the second-floor landing that refused to die and therefore had become everyone's responsibility. Sorrel watered it on Wednesdays and whispered conspiracies to it on Fridays because it made her laugh, and laughing was a currency she could afford in small denominations. On the walk home, she passed the mural under the overpass, a river of color painted by kids at the Arts Center, and the laundromat where people made fresh starts one spin at a time. She watched a girl in a blue hoodie dance with an empty basket and envied the way some people could turn waiting into choreography. The city smelled like warm breaks and the kind of rain that couldn't commit. Cars moved with that tired tenderness streets get after rush hour, as if everyone had finally remembered they were transporting lives and not just bodies. Sorrel let herself into apartment 3C and listened to the quiet with the care you give bad news. The place was small, but it knew her name. The couch with its stubborn springs, the plant on the windowsill determined to photosynthesize or die trying, the kettle that made a sound like a question just before it boiled. She hung her jacket, lined up her shoes, and stood in the center of the room as if waiting for instructions. Her phone buzzed, A message from her sister, Lale, who was a coast and a philosophy degree away. "How's the empire of eggs and coffee?" Sorrel thumb-typed back, "Profitable in gratitude, poor in absolutes." Lale sent a string of knives and hearts, which, in the language they'd invented when there weren't enough words to reach each other, meant, "I'm proud of you. Keep going." The kettle questioned. Sorrel answered with tea and the kind of toast that admits it's really just bread trying to be warm. She ate at the counter, watching the square of sky her window allowed. Somewhere out there, Calder was a moving point in a geometry she could not see. She told herself it didn't matter. People passed through her life like weather. Her job was to dress accordingly and keep the floor dry. Night softened the corners of the city. Neon stitched itself along the boulevard. The fern in the stairwell sighed in the draft and refused to drop a single leaf. Sorrel washed dishes she could have left for morning. That's how she survived the big chaos, by beating the little ones to the door. Around 10, the sound came. Not loud enough to announce itself, not timid enough to be accidental. A car settled outside as if setting down a decision. Sorrel would later tell herself that the city makes that sound all the time, that cars pause and people check their maps, and the planet rotates with 1,000 small hesitations. But this sound had the weight of a period at the end of a sentence she didn't remember writing. She moved to the window and lifted the slat of the blind with one finger. On the street below, a black SUV idled under the streetlight where the bulb had learned the art of flicker. The vehicle wasn't glossy in a bragging way. It was the kind of black that drank light and gave nothing back. The windows were darker than the math allowed. It blocked half the street, a whale that had decided an alley was a river it could test. Her first thought was, wrong address. Her second was, someone else's story. Her third, arriving with the precision of a habit, was a quick audit of every reason a black SUV might stop under your window at night. Neighbor trouble, domestic argument, delivery lost, surveillance you could explain away if you were the kind of person who had explanations. Sorrel had none that would satisfy anyone requiring them. She stayed at the window longer than she meant to, learning the rhythm of the vehicle's idle, the way it vibrated just enough to confess the engine was bored, not sleeping. A front door opened, closed, footsteps on concrete, then silence so careful it almost squeaked.
Sorrel let the blind fall and felt her heart begin to count backwards. She told herself she wouldn't be the person who peered through blinds like a sound effect. She also told herself fear was an animal that deserved the right to sniff the air before anyone called it a coward. She turned off the kitchen light and walked to the door, bare feet remembering the floorboard's opinions. She looked through the peephole. The hallway was a film, waiting for actors. Knock. It wasn't loud, the kind of knock you use when you want conversation to be your weapon, not volume. Sorrel inhaled, organized her breath like cutlery, and asked the question of the century. Who is it? A woman's voice, shaped like she'd brought the whole building its own weather. Miss Aiden? In the peephole's fisheye, Sorrel saw only the smudge of hallway light and the geometry of her own fear. She did the thing she always did when life pushed her into the cold. She made a small joke no one would hear. Depends on who's asking, she said. The voice again, unhurried. My name is Mara Devine. We need a minute of your time. We? Sorrel repeated, because plural pronouns hid entire cities. There was the hush of a practiced pause. Please open the door. It's important.
Sorrel let the blind fall and felt her heart begin to count backwards. She told herself she wouldn't be the person who peered through blinds like a sound effect. She also told herself fear was an animal that deserved the right to sniff the air before anyone called it a coward. She turned off the kitchen light and walked to the door, bare feet remembering the floorboard's opinions. She looked through the peephole. The hallway was a film waiting for actors. Knock. It wasn't loud. The kind of knock you use when you want conversation to be your weapon, not volume. Sorrel inhaled, organized her breath like cutlery, and asked the question of the century. Who is it? A woman's voice, shaped like she'd brought the whole building its own weather. Miss Aiden? In the pea-hole's fisheye, Sorrel saw only the smudge of hallway light and the geometry of her own fear. She did the thing she always did when life pushed her into the cold. She made a small joke no one would hear. Depends on who's asking, she said. The voice again, unhurried. My name is Mara Devine. We need a minute of your time. We? Sorrel repeated, because plural pronouns hid entire cities. There was the hush of a practiced pause. Please open the door. It's important. Sorrel swallowed. She considered leaving the chain on, calling Mr. Baines, phoning no one and pretending she wasn't home, telling the truth like a dare and climbing out the window onto the fire escape to consult with the fern like it was a war room. She did none of those things. She opened the door exactly 2 inches. A woman stood in the hallway wearing a suit that didn't believe in second drafts. She was mid-40s, hair braided back like a promise not to be distracted, eyes that had read rooms most people never entered. Behind her, the hallway was the same old nothing. Mara Devine held out a small leather folio the color of serious decisions. Please, she said. It's about a driver who came into your diner this morning. Sorrel's spine found a new way to be straight. Behind Mara, the stairwell awoke and exhaled. I don't give out customer information, Sorrel heard herself say, even though the policy manual of the diner had never asked her to be a gatekeeper for other people's lives, because management assumed none of them mattered to anyone who could afford an SUV the size of a careful threat. We're not asking for anything you haven't already given, Mara replied. You gave him a paper bag. Sorrel felt the world tilt 5 degrees. That's not illegal, she said, and was briefly annoyed with herself for sounding like someone who had rehearsed this moment in the shower and still missed the good lines. It was kind, Mara said, and it might have saved his life. There it was, the part of the sentence that changed its own temperature as it left the mouth. Sorrel let it hang like a light bulb you don't screw in all the way because you're not sure you want the room it will make. Who are you? She asked, because name started to matter. Mara opened the folio just long enough to show something that might have been a badge or might have been a very persuasive piece of graphic design. She closed it before Sorrel to teach her eyes to memorize it. We're here to make sure you're safe, and to ask you to come with us. Sorrel blinked. Now? Now. The word arranged the air into a corridor with no doors. The SUV idled. The hallway held its breath. The fern on the landing, somewhere between here and whatever came next, leaned a fraction toward the light. Sorrel looked down at her bare feet and thought of every shift she'd worked to afford the shoes that would make her look like a person who didn't need to prove anything. She thought of Calder's hands around the coffee cup, the way he'd said "West" like a prayer. She thought of the paper bag under her counter and the other one under his arm, and the way a small kindness sometimes felt like you were handing a stranger a key you didn't know fit your own lock. What happens if I say no? She asked quietly. Mara didn't blink. Then we'll have to protect you here, she said, and we can try, but the people who followed him will try harder. Followed? The word sounded like tires eating rain. Miss Aden, Mara said, voice thinning into urgency. We have to move. This isn't a movie. The ones who want him are not waiting for better dialogue. Sorrel lifted the chain, opened the door the rest of the way, and the hallway widened as if the building itself was willing her to choose its next shape. She reached for her jacket, her phone, the instinct to lock things that had never been permitted to belong to her in any permanent way. She turned back to the room that had held the last quiet version of her life and recognized it for what it had been, a waiting area with decent light. Mara stepped back to give her space. Keys? Sorrel pocketed them. "I'll water the fern tomorrow," she said, because if she didn't say something ordinary, she was sure her voice would forget how to behave. In the stairwell, their footfalls sounded like a drum trained to keep soldiers moving. On the second-floor landing, the fern didn't ask questions. Sorrel touched a leaf without realizing she was saying goodbye. The SUV's door opened with a whisper that implied doors had secrets when they were engineered well enough. Inside, the air was cool with the faint scent of leather that had studied at the School of Expensive Denials. "Seatbelt," Mara said. Sorrel clicked it with a precise reluctance. The driver was a man whose face had been issued minimal details for convenience. His eyes met Sorrel's in the rearview mirror and slid away fast, like they'd been taught to pretend people were scenery. As the SUV pulled away, Sorrel watched her building shrink into perspective, a geometry she could no longer solve. The city rolled past like a film edited to remove every laugh track. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere we can talk. Somewhere no one who isn't invited can find." "Is that a place?" Sorrel asked, because disbelief was cheaper than panic. "For tonight, it is," Mara said. They drove without radio. The hum of the road collected at the base of Sorrel's skull like old rain deciding it was still weather. Street after street passed, then fewer streets, then the kind of industrial edges cities use to remember the bones under their pretty faces. They dipped under a bridge, skirted a yard full of shipping containers that looked like a game played by giants with excellent spatial reasoning, and slid into a stretch of road where security cameras were part of the architecture the way ivy is part of a ruin. "Tell me about him," Mara said at last. Sorrel held on to the pronoun for a moment. Bad grammar to put your fear in a sentence without a proper noun. "He didn't say much," she began. "He ate like a person who respects hunger. He paid cash. He said West like he wanted to be careful not to lie to it. He thanked me for a paper bag like it was heavier than bread." "He didn't tell you his name?" Mara asked. "Calder," Sorrel said, and the name landed in the dim car like a chord that had finally found its resolution. Mara's breath did something extremely small. "Calder Pike," she said, almost to herself. "You know him," Sorrel said, trying not to make it a question and failing. "I know of him," Mara corrected, "and I know who knows him. I also know who wants him to stop existing." Sorrel tried to imagine a world in which anyone put Calder and stop existing in the same policy memo. All she could find was a diner filled with ordinary people choosing their temporary names for the day. "I poured him coffee," Sorrel said, a protest so small it embarrassed her. "That's all?" "That might be all," Mara said, "and it might be exactly enough." The SUV turned into a garage so clean the concrete looked recent. A steel door hissed them into a space that believed walls were promises. They were ushered down a corridor so white it made Sorrel miss her apartment's stubborn shadows. In a room that was the cousin of a hospital and an airplane lounge, comfortable and prepared for emergencies, Mara gestured toward a chair. "Sit, breathe, listen." 3 verbs, 1 lifeline. Mara took the seat opposite, folded one leg over the other like decisions were best made with your feet reminding you how to move, and set a small black case on the table between them. She opened it with a motion that suggested she'd once had to do the same thing very fast in a place that was on fire. Inside lay a collection of objects that did not belong together. An earpiece, a USB drive shaped like the world's most boring key, a roll of medical tape, and a pen that might have been just a pen if it hadn't been in that case among other things that were pretending to be less than they were. "Calder Pike," Mara began, "drives a lot. He also carries things that shouldn't exist and information that changes rooms when it enters them. He does not belong to anyone, which irritates certain kinds of people more than anything you can do with a weapon. This morning, when he sat in your section, he had a 42-hour head start on people who believe that if they can't own something, they should erase it. He was hungry. You fed him. That changed the timeline. Sorrel's heart did that confusing thing where it learned a new rhythm and decided to try it on. You're saying I moved a clock? I'm saying you made it harder to break one, she said. We think he needed those calories to make a decision he wouldn't have had the energy to survive otherwise. You gave him a margin. Margins save lives. The room hummed softly with equipment Sorrel didn't understand, and the idea that kindness was infrastructure. So why am I here? If he's the map and the message, I'm just a pin someone forgot to pull out after the trip. Because the people who followed him don't like unknowns. They'll try to pull apart everything that touches the route he took, including you.
And you? Sorrel asked. Who are you inside this sentence? Mara considered. Like honesty was a grenade you could throw gently if you had the right hands. We're the ones who try to keep people like you from becoming collateral damage in other people's math. Sorrel said, Watcher, fixer, guardian? Some days we just carry umbrellas, Mara said. This is a rain day. They talked. About the diner's cameras, 2, one that worked. About the alley cats, 2, also one that worked. About whether Sorrel had noticed anyone unusual at lunch. Yes, the briefcase man, and also a woman who cried at a tuna meld and ate every bite. Sorrel told them the ordinary list of events because ordinary is what you only miss when it's gone. She asked why a trucker's name would make a professional's breath hitch, and Mara said she respected questions the way doctors respect healthy organs. The answer came wrapped in an apology. Because Calder Pike is a courier for people who don't want to trust networks. Sometimes that's a heartbreaking love letter no algorithm should read. Sometimes it's a hard drive that could unmake a boardroom. Sometimes it's a body that needs to cross a border without anyone noticing it is softer than luggage. He puts himself between desperate and delivered. The people who hate that kind of man have longer budgets than he has sentences. Sorrel realized she'd been holding her teacup with a grip appropriate for cliff edges. She set it down, empty, imaginary, and stared at the pen in Mara's case. Do I have a choice in any of this? Always. Choosing takes longer when you're scared. We're not in a luxury time zone. A door opened. The man with the minimum face returned, whispered something that took 6 seconds to finish. Mara's eyes hardened like glass cooling. She turned back to Sorrel. They know who you are. They're on the block. Here? The word arrived not as a question, but a weather report. Here, Mara said. We're moving. Again. They moved. Back through the white corridor, into the SUV that had learned not to sound like it was running, out into streets that had already begun to practice their alibis. Sorrel leaned her head against the cool window and tried to imagine what her sister would say if she knew any of this. Probably something about how some lives bend without breaking, how people are rubber if they believe in their elasticity. Sorrel did not feel like rubber. She felt like glass finally admitting it was sand. Where to now? She asked in a voice that hoped the car would answer. North, the driver said, discovering that words could asphyxiate if he kept them underwater too long. Mara's phone buzzed once, the sound of catastrophe practicing pianissimo. She spoke into it with clipped grace, then turned to Sorrel. Do you remember if he touched your hand when you gave him the bag? Sorrel's mind went back, unspooling the morning like thread you hope still loves its needle. No, he made a point not to. He thoughtfulness the space. Good, Mara said, and then added a word that belonged in medical journals and war rooms. Maybe. They left the industrial bones of the city and found a road that knew trees. The SUV ate distance like it had a bet with dawn. The driver checked mirrors as if he were reading a language that lived there. Sorrel watched her breath write ghost letters on the glass and pretended she could read them back. Do you want to know why he's running? Mara asked at last. No, Sorrel said, then surprised herself. Yes. No, I want to know if what I did mattered. It did.
even if you never know how. "Tell me anyway," Sorrel said. And that was the moment she documented as the one where the old version of her stopped asking permission to be curious about her own life. Mara exhaled. "There's a company with a habit of confusing people with problems. Calder has something that company would rather feed to a furnace than a courtroom. He'd arranged a meeting with a journalist in Sacramento who thinks daylight is a disinfectant and knows which agencies prefer bleach. Your bag bought him the hour he needed to avoid a checkpoint we didn't know they'd set. Without it, he would have stopped somewhere he couldn't leave."
Something did happen. A black sedan pulled in too slowly, then too fast, then stopped across two spaces like it wanted to argue with Euclid. Two men got out, both wearing the kind of denim that thinks it's invisible. One went inside. The other pretended to clean his windshield while looking everywhere else. Mara stepped out. The driver kept the engine patient. Sorrel watched Mara cross to the cashier with the practiced casual of someone who could make a line out of any set of dots. The man from the sedan watched the watch he wasn't wearing. Sorrel looked at the number on the card in her hand and tried not to think about shorelines, which are usually where things break elegantly. Then the gas station door opened, and a person who didn't belong to any of these sentences stepped out. A teenage girl, in a red apron, holding a bag of ice like a shield. She tripped, the ice burst, and suddenly the concrete was a small galaxy of cold stars. Everyone looked. The man by the windshield, the driver in the sedan, Mara turned, the cashier looked up, the universe expanded by one distraction. Sorrel's eyes went to the teenager's hands, pinking at the edges, gathering cold. No one moved to help her. The men scanned, clocked, recalculated. Sorrel unclicked her seatbelt. She opened the door. She couldn't not. She crossed the space between this moment and the next and crouched beside the girl. "You okay?" she asked, already helping scoop ice back into a torn plastic bag and then into the trash, because you can't put a spill back in its container. "I'm fine," the girl said, which is what we say when we're not and the people around us are terrible at triage. "Hands?" Sorrel asked. The girl nodded. Sorrel pressed the girl's palms against the bag that had survived. "Keep them there. Cold is a good liar, but we can use it." The girl looked at her like she'd been told a secret, then looked past her to the men who had stopped pretending not to stare. Mara was suddenly beside them, having crossed the parking lot without making footsteps. "We have to," she began, but didn't finish because the man at the windshield had decided to make himself into a problem. He stepped forward, too friendly, too fast. "Car trouble?" he said to no one. "Need a hand?" Mara stood in a way that said, no. Sorrel felt the air tilt again and understood that, regardless of what came next, she had already left the version of herself who watched and waited from safe distances. She spoke without rehearsing. "We're good," she said. "Thanks." Her voice was steady. She surprised herself again and decided she should start trusting the person who lived in her mouth more often. A siren sounded somewhere, not here. Far enough to be plausible, close enough to change choreography. The man at the windshield looked toward the sound. Mara used his glance like a door and moved all three of them, Sorrel, the girl with cold hands, and herself, back toward the SUV in a geometry that felt practiced. The driver had the passenger door open before they arrived, an absence making room for them. "Go," Mara said to the girl. "Inside. Lock. Keep your head down until we're gone." The girl didn't argue. She slid in, small and brave, and suddenly Sorrel understood that you don't always get to choose your passengers. Sometimes they are delivered by ice. The sedan revved. The driver in the SUV accelerated so smoothly physics blushed. They cut a line back to the highway while the men in denim debated whether to pursue and who would tell their boss why they'd lost an argument with melting conditions. The girl's breath was loud in the back seat, a small animal learning a bigger cage. "What's your name?" Sorrel asked, because names are blankets in weather like this. "Jules," the girl said, and already sounded like someone who would stop being a trainee this week regardless of the schedule. "Hi, Jules," Sorrel said. "I'm Sorrel. This is Mara. That is a driver who deserves a raise." Jules almost laughed. "Where are we going?" she asked, already trusting a future that hadn't earned it yet.
Somewhere ordinary, and safer than ordinary, Mara said. The highway took them back, as highways do when you apologize. They rode through a night that had put on every star it could find. Sorrel thought of Calder again, somewhere on a ribbon of west, and silently begged whatever gods accept petitions from waitresses to keep him between the lines. She thought of how small kindnesses were really just bridges that didn't brag about their architecture. They reached a motel that understood discretion as a business model. The parking lot was a geometry of faded lines and plausible deniability. Inside, the manager wore the same face at midnight and noon and had mastered the art of charging slightly less than what guilt would pay. Mara booked 2 rooms and used a name that would dissolve in water. In the room, which smelled faintly of citrus and a decision to be clean, Jules sat on the edge of a bed as if waiting for a test that used questions instead of multiple choice. Mara handed her water. "You did good," she said. "Bad situations pick smart people. They picked you." Jules nodded like she'd write that down later and draw a star next to it. Mara turned to Sorrel. "We'll be here for 2 hours," she said. "Then we move again. If anyone knocks, don't answer unless it's me saying the word shoreline. If it's not that word, it's not me." "Why shoreline?" Sorrel asked. Because her brain had decided it could either be rational or quiet and had gone with the first. "Because it's where land and water negotiate. And because a long time ago, someone I loved taught me to keep my promises at the edge of things." Things were at the edge. The room's curtain lifted slightly in the AC's sigh, like it was practicing revealing and hiding in equal measure. Sorrel sat on the second bed, took off her shoes, and looked at her feet like they were tools that needed better maintenance. "I don't know how to be in this," she admitted. "This feels like a movie cut to the scenes where the protagonist acquires trauma." "You breathe. You listen. You ask for what you need," Mara said. "What I need is to know if Calder is okay." The last word fractured into its smaller versions. Safe. Alive. Not a ghost. Mara's eyes softened in a way that made Sorrel understand the woman had once needed the same thing from someone else. "We don't know," she said. "But he had a lead, and sometimes a lead is just enough light to choose forward." Sorrel nodded. She watched Jules fall asleep in the world's loudest silence. She tried to sleep and failed, and spoke to the ceiling as if it were qualified to answer. After a while, time losing its shape like cheap ice, Mara excused herself to make a call outside. The door closed with the politeness of someone who had been taught not to wake children. Sorrel lay on her side and listened to the hum of the room, learning her breath. Anxiety tried to storyboard terrible what-ifs. She turned to look at Jules, who had the soft, stubborn face of someone whose life was still mostly ahead of her. Sorrel got up, tugged the blanket over the girl's shoulder, and discovered in the act of tucking in a stranger that her hands could be anchors too. The knock came soft as a rumor. A pause, then another. "Shoreline," Mara's voice said through the door. Sorrel stood, heart suddenly a metronome set to allegretto. She opened the door 2 inches, then all the way because she recognized the shape of Mara's patience. Mara stepped in, and 2 men in the hallway stepped forward too, faster than alarms, their shadows moving like incoming weather. Mara's hand went to the case. Sorrel's hand went to Jules' shoulder. The first man smiled the kind of smile that doesn't ask permission and said the single word designed to unlock panic in ordinary people who got brave at gas stations.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The hallway surged like a throat swallowing. Sorrel's fingers tightened on Jules' shoulder as the man who'd smiled without permission took 1 step into the room, one hand open and empty, the other tucked behind his thigh where the worst ideas wait. Mara moved first, no wasted noise, just velocity, interposing her body between the men and the girls the way a door chooses to be a wall. "Not 1 more inch," she said, voice bent into a lever. The driver's shadow appeared at the far end of the corridor like a promise the building hadn't realized it could keep. The first man's smile tried to occupy more space. "Miss Devine," he said, pronouncing her name with the care of someone unwrapping an antique. "You're trespassing on our search warrant."
On your imagination, Mara corrected. You have papers for a different address and a different century. The second man shifted, revealing the shape behind his thigh, a collapsing baton that tried to look like a toy. He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. Threats do their best work when they can claim they were only standing there. Jules' breath hitched. Sorrel leaned her weight subtly against the girl, becoming a small gravity. She felt a bright, treacherous calm slide into place inside her ribs. Panic had knocked. Something else answered. "Back up," she said. No shout, just architecture. Door frame is the line. You cross it and you're trespassing on a rumor of a felony. The first man's eyes flickered to the corners of the ceiling, checking for cameras. The motel had one, a plastic spider eye that recorded a new ghost every hour. The driver took 2 silent steps closer, his face still running minimum details, his hands visible and empty. "Gentlemen," he said, "you've misplaced your evening." "Have we?" Not a question, an invitation to a wrong answer. The baton clicked longer. The air changed its density. For a flash, Sorrel saw herself from a distance. Waitress, barefooted not long ago, now barefoot in a room where the floor had become a choice. She heard Lale's long-ago voice, from a voicemail she'd saved but never replayed. "If you find yourself in a room with men who think they own the air, borrow it loudly."
"Jules," Sorrel whispered. "Bathroom."
The girl blinked and moved, a small fox accepting a tunnel. Sorrel followed one step, then pivoted back, her body remembering the rhythm of crowded brunches where she'd slipped through people and heat without spilling anyone's morning. The first man lifted his hands higher, palms out like a magician ready to fail. "We only need a statement," he said. "Then everybody sleeps." "Say your company," Mara replied. "Say it like you say conflict of interest." He smiled again. "We consult." "Predators always do," Mara said, and the driver's hand twitched in a language Sorrel didn't speak. The baton man took his cue, stepping over the line. Motion swallowed talk. Mara's case snapped open like a verdict, and the pen that wasn't a pen arced, struck the baton with a sound like a tuning fork reconsidering. The baton fell. The driver pivoted, his knee found the second man's thigh, and the corridor filled with the delicate music of someone losing a plan. Sorrel didn't think. She reached for the motel's heavy ice bucket, the kind designed to outlive the apocalypse, and flung it forward. Not at heads, she didn't own that kind of aim. At shins, where indignity lives. The first man went down on one knee, a prayer he'd never chosen. Mara moved through the space created by his new height. Palm to wrist, elbow to doorframe, the engineered choreography of sending a person to the floor without making a speech about it. "Out," Mara told Sorrel and Jules, already dragging the nearer man into the hallway so the door could close. The driver backed them all out of the room, into the corridor, into the stairwell where a metal echo admitted physics was still in charge. They didn't run so much as prepare the air for their absence. By the time the baton man's oaths remembered how to stand, the 3 of them were in the SUV, doors whispering shut, engine discovering a new verb. They hit the road. Sorrel's heart, having filed its earlier complaint, now worked overtime without overtime pay. Jules sat small and electric, clutching the card with the faint number like it could turn into a boat. Mara checked the rear view, the side mirror, the blind spot, the future. "Did I just assault a consultant with an ice bucket?" Sorrel asked, her voice calm enough to alarm her. "Yes," Mara said, eyes on the rear view. "He'll invoice the universe." Jules made a small sound that could have been a laugh if it weren't wearing a disguise. They took surface streets first, letting the SUV's black subtract them from the arithmetic of the night. "We can't go back to the facility," the driver said. "They'll have the perimeter memorized." "We go to Shoreline," Mara said. The word landed with the authority of an address. "Shoreline," the driver repeated into the car's bones, and the vehicle changed lanes the way a river accepts a new bank. Is shoreline an actual shore or just the name for a place with low opinions? Both, Mara said. You'll see. They rode through a city that had put its jewelry away. Sorrel watched building after building decide to be boxes again. She thought of Calder on whatever Western ribbon had accepted his weight, and bread and apples going into a mouth that chased miles. She wanted him to be in a place where the word safe could afford to be boring. Mara's phone trembled once against her palm. She answered with a sound that wasn't quite a word. She listened. "Copy," she said. Then to Sorrel. "He made Sacramento. He is not with the journalist yet. He needs an hour." "Give him mine," Sorrel said, before realizing time was not a wallet she could empty onto the table. "You already did," Mara said, not unkindly. "You said shoreline," Sorrel said. "What is it?" Mara considered, then decided to tell the truth quickly, like a bandage that respects time. "The people after him are attached to a private security firm with a habit of doing public work in private ways. They don't like courts. We have—" she searched for a noun that didn't embarrass itself. "Friends. People who believe sunlight still humiliates mold. Shoreline is one of our friends' addresses. We can trade tonight's storms for their weather." "Are we the storm?" Sorrel asked. "We're the roof," Mara said. "They're the nails." "Can I be the fern?" Jules whispered, surprising herself. "Stubborn, hard to kill." Sorrel smiled and reached back, squeezed the girl's fingers. "You already are." They drove north, then toward the edge where warehouses forgot their company names and looked like long, careful secrets. The SUV dipped into a tunnel that smelled faintly of salt and electricity. A gate admitted them, because gates remember who treated them with respect. They emerged into a garage whose doors knew how to seal a story. Inside, a room brighter than fear, softer than hospitals. People who looked like librarians who'd read the wrong books and decided to fix the index. A woman with gray at her temples and kindness at the corners of her eyes stepped forward. "I'm Ariva," she said, and her voice was a porch light. "You're safe to exhale." Jules exhaled the kind of breath that makes a person sit down whether there's a chair there or not. Sorrel exhaled halfway and decided the other half would require convincing. Mara introduced them quickly, efficiently, like names were currencies that would be exchanged later. "We need a 2-hour box," she told Riva. "The other team has our street. They'll broaden their map. Calder's clock says 60 minutes to a journalist who still calls ink holy." "We'll buy him 90, Riva said, already directing quiet people toward computers and screens and the kind of work that looks like sitting very still while moving mountains. She led Sorrel and Jules into a room with couches and a tea station and a wall of photographs that made Sorrel stop. Landscapes, coasts mostly, caught in the moment where water negotiates with land. Some nights the ocean won, some nights the shore smiled politely and said, "Try again tomorrow." "Shoreline," Sorrel said, and Riva nodded. "Most days we hold, some days we flood on purpose." They sat. Someone wordless placed tea in their hands because warm things remind bodies to make room for themselves. Jules wrapped her fingers around the mug and let the heat argue with the chill living under her skin. Sorrel stared into her cup and saw nothing but herself, which was somehow enough. "Tell me about the diner," Riva said, not prying, just making a map. Sorrel described coffee as a system and pie as a form of triage. She said the morning was ordinary until it wasn't, and a man named Calder had looked at the window when he spoke to her because some people learn early that direct eyes can be receipts. She told them about the black SUV and the knock and the word now, and the motel and the ice, and how a teenager became cargo in a car meant for ghosts. Riva listened like she majored in it. "You're a good witness," she said. "You save details without making them ask for visas."
"I serve coffee," Sorrel said, as if the universe might send back a different resume if she admitted the smaller one out loud. "You see people," Riva corrected. "That's the rarer skill." Mara appeared in the doorway with a different temperature around her.
"They're triangulating," she said quietly. "Two cars casing the diner, another near Sorrel's building. Their finances are majestic and their patience is limited." "You'll stay here tonight," Riva said to Sorrel and Jules with a kindness that had logistics under it. "In the morning, we'll move you to a place with less poetry and more fences. For now, you split the room. If anyone knocks, you say shoreline and ask what it negotiates with. If they don't answer water, you don't open." "Shoreline negotiates with water," Jules repeated like a multiplication table she planned to deface with hearts later. Mara checked her phone again. "He's close," she said. She stopped, a rare thing for her voice to do. She turned the screen so Riva could see. Riva inhaled. "What?" Sorrel asked, failing to keep the question from sharpening. "Checkpoint," Mara said. "Not an official one." Sorrel's body remembered the diner in an instant. The bell, the coffee, the way Calder had carefully not touched her hand. She pictured him at an intersection of men who thought roads were invoices. "Can we help?" she asked, and knew the question made her into a person her earlier self would have studied and not recognized. Riva gave her a look that combined old grief and new respect. "Maybe," she said. "Mara." Mara sat, an action that looked like she had agreed to explain something complicated. "Calder knows how to drive around most nets," she said. "This one is improvised but well-informed. They'll have a vehicle that looks like construction, a vehicle that looks like an apology, and at least one person with a clipboard because clipboards can hypnotize driver's licenses." Sorrel thought of napkins and order chits and the way people's lives changed shape when they were hungry. "He tends to the space between words," she murmured. "He'll see the clipboard. He'll see the apology. He'll go where the road tells him he is still allowed." "Exactly. Which is why we need a different voice to tell him he is allowed somewhere else." "You can talk to him?" Sorrel asked, hope trying on a coat. "Not directly, but he's about to enter a strip where the radio antennas are older than dignity. They leak. We can override the local frequency for 60 seconds. She looked at Sorrel, not Riva. "He knows your voice." Sorrel's mouth went dry the way deserts do when they're tired of pretending to be beautiful. "I poured him 1 cup of coffee," she said, and then realized the truth inside the protest. "And I saw him." Riva was already moving, sending someone to the comms room, someone else to maps. Mara walked Sorrel through a door into a chamber where microphones and dials pretended to be instruments in an orchestra whose conductor hated applause. A technician with hair the color of patience slid a headset toward her. "He's local," he said. "We'll catch what the checkpoint thinks is theirs." "What do I say?" she asked, suddenly vertiginous with choices. 2 sentences. One that sounds like you at a diner, one that sounds like a map. Sorrel closed her eyes and thought of steam and plates in the morning's light. When she opened them, she met the microphone like a friend. The technician counted down from 5 with his fingers. On 1, Sorrel spoke. The shape of her voice the same shape it had been when she had offered refills to men who didn't deserve them and to women who needed more than coffee. "Calder," she said. "This is Sorrel from the booth by the window. We still have pie." Mar nodded once. The technician flicked a switch, pointed, a cue to continue before the leak sealed. Sorrel saw an intersection she'd never stand at, a clipboard that believed in itself, and a truck that needed a story. "Take the service road behind the orange cones. They forgot to measure their own shadow."
The technician cut the channel, hands moving like a pianist apologizing to a metronome. Mara exhaled so quietly it might have been the room settling. Now there was nothing to do but wait for someone else's fate to consider their math. They waited. Time learned new hobbies. Jules appeared at the door, eyes wide not with fear, but with the realization that she had become a paragraph in a bigger book. Riva stood slightly behind Mara, hands folded the way people do when they trust the more inside the tent of their own calm. Mara's phone answered a question she hadn't asked out loud. She read,
then let the edges of her mouth admit a molecule of triumph. "He cleared it," she said. "He's moving again." Sorrel sat, suddenly exhausted, as if her bones had decided to be honest. Mara put a hand on her shoulder. "Good voice," she said. "He'll hear it and know to be suspicious of coincidence," Sorrel replied. But she allowed herself the small, ridiculous hope that he'd remembered the apples. Riva looked at the wall clock. 40 minutes to the meeting spot, she said. "The journalist is smart, good mortal. They'll have to choose a different table every 5 minutes for the next decade if we pull this off." Jules wandered to the photograph wall, stopped in front of an image where waves climbed a cliff, and the cliff looked back, unimpressed. "What happens to us?" she asked the picture, then turned to the humans. "I mean, after." "After what?" Mara asked. "After the trucker meets the ink paladin, and the bad men remember they loved clipboards first," Jules said, finding fluency in this new dialect. "You go home," Riva said gently. "With a number to call if the air looks crowded. We make sure your boss gives you Tuesday off even if the schedule cries. You tell your mother the world isn't only the shape the news gives it." "And me?" Sorrel asked, surprising herself again with the assumption that there was a separate answer. "You choose," Riva said. "If you want, you go back to the diner with a better lock and a camera that works and an envelope of cash for rent in case your tips get shy around attention. Or you stay a while and let us show you how to set tables in rooms like this. We're always short on people who can see." Sorrel's throat burned, not with tears, but with the feeling of being handed a key she hadn't known she'd built. "I have a sister. She worries like it's cardio. I'd need to tell her I wasn't abducted by my own bad ideas." "You will," Riva said. "Only the good ideas are sanctioned here." Minutes lengthened. The technician in the comms room narrated quietly to Mara in the shorthand of weather. Gust, lull, crosswind. Then, "It's on." A screen lit with a live feed hijacked from a camera that didn't want to be helpful. The image, grainy, like most truth, showed a handoff in a park wrung out by daylight. A man in a cap sitting with his back to a bronze sculpture of a runner who'd forgotten to stop. Another person approaching with a newspaper that still trusted ink. 2 teenagers skateboarding through someone else's plot, and an old man feeding pigeons with a concentration that elevated it to liturgy. "That's him. And that's our journalist. And those are 3 people who were paid to look like they're not." "Can they hear us?" Jules asked, as if she could whisper loud enough to cross states. "No," the technician said. "But we can heckle circumstances." Mara's hands hovered over the table, not touching. "We tip the pigeons," she said. The technician nodded, tapped into a frequency that wasn't so much a frequency as an agreement. The park's sprinklers, aging, cranky, decided to remember how to be dramatic. Water arced across the lawn with the vengeful joy of neglected machinery. The 3 paid wallflowers adjusted their angles like sunflowers offended by rain. The journalist laughed out loud and moved to a bench under a tree out of range. Calder followed, shoulders relaxing a fraction.
"Good," Mara murmured. "Now don't get clever. Just pass the—" A figure stepped into the frame's edge. Not one of the 3. Someone fast, economical, with a messenger bag worn like intention. They moved not toward Calder, but toward the journalist. The bag lifted. Not a weapon. Paper. A decoy copy of the same newspaper. The swap could be done like a magic trick you'd spot only if you hated joy. "Left," Sorrel said to no one, or to the screen, or to the space between a man's hand and a world on paper. "Left." She didn't know if he heard, but Calder turned his head slightly, the way a driver checks mirrors before they change fate. He saw the bag, saw the double newspaper, saw the journalist's smile. He reached not for the paper, but for the journalist's elbow, the way you do when you're about to do something rude and need to preface it with contact. He upended the journalist, hard but gentle, off the bench. The bag's owner misjudged distance. The newspaper landed on the wet grass. Pigeons decided the world had finally given them something decent to read and descended accordingly. "That'll ruin a hard drive," the technician observed. Calder stepped backward into a spritz of sprinkler rain, then forward into the bag-bearer's space. They traded weight and regret. The journalist rolled, popped up, and responded with surprising competence for a person who made a living asking questions at safe distances. The three paid wallflowers, soaked and angry, gave up their disguise and sprinted too late to the center of the stage where the script had been rewritten while they were defending dryness. Riva smiled like a tired teacher whose students had finally turned in homework she knew they were capable of. "Run, mailman," she whispered, and on screen Calder and the journalist did. Not far, not forever, just enough to reach a van that believed in second chances. The doors closed. The vehicle became background. The pigeons, offended, returned to their meal. Mara's phone vibrated. She read something that made the corners of her eyes crinkle like paper being folded into a crane. "She has a mail," she said, encrypted. "He says, 'Tell the waitress the pie was perfect.'" Sorrel swallowed a noise she did not recognize as a cry until it threatened to electrocute her voice. "Tell him we still have apples," she said, and she decided she would believe in coincidences only when they arrived with official paperwork. Riva nodded to the technician, who nodded to the ghost in the machine, who nodded to an idea older than electricity, that sometimes messages intended for destruction find better readers. The screen cycled to black. The room exhaled like lungs after a held breath that was beginning to be expensive. "Now what?" Jules asked, having learned the necessary addiction to the next page. "Now we make 3 copies of what he delivered. We hand them to 3 people who hate each other but love a scoop. We name the corporation 50 different things in 50 different places and lock the ones that cannot run behind injunctions that will embarrass the lawyers who wrote them. And we give this to agencies who will pretend they discovered it themselves after their coffee cooled." "And us?" Sorrel asked, eyeing the doorway as if it were a mouth with opinions. "You sleep," Riva said, "or pretend." They moved to a small room with 2 beds and the kind of nightstand that had to prove itself every day. Jules took the bed by the window because she wanted to be the first to see morning if it agreed to arrive. Sorrel lay on the other, shoes off, adrenaline inside her like a meteor shower that refused to choose a constellation. Mara stood in the doorway, half in, half out, like she'd made a truce with thresholds. "Why do you do this?" Sorrel asked her in the hush that good rooms permit. She looked at the floor as if answers might be hiding in the scuffs, and then at Sorrel. "Because when I was younger, someone handed me an apple in a hallway where I thought I'd starve. And because a stranger saw me without taking anything." "Strangers keep saving you," Sorrel said. "They become less strange," Riva replied. "Sleep." Sleep arrived disguised as collapse. Sorrel dreamed of highways that braided and unbraided themselves, and of a man whose cap was a compass that always pointed toward the next decent thing. She woke once to the soft thunder of distant trucks and the quieter weather of Jules breathing steadily as if practicing for a life that would continue.
Morning came with coffee that didn't need to be excellent and eggs that did their job without auditioning for better careers. Riva briefed them at a table ringed by people who had learned to make crisis look like clerical work. "It's out," she said, meaning the files. 3 outlets, 3 agencies, 1 foreign journalist who will publish no matter who calls him names. The company's stock is doing what stones do when they remember gravity. "What about the men with their batons and confidence?" Sorrel asked. "Heads will roll," Mara said, "onto other bodies, but their budget just got smaller." "And him?" Jules asked. "Calder?" Mara's mouth softened again. "He's 2 states away already. He says he's found a stretch where the sky feels honest." "Does he know I talked to the radio?" Sorrel asked, flush rising uninvited. Mara's eyes warmed. "He knows your voice found him at a fork." A beat. "He asked if you'll be at the diner tomorrow." Sorrel's breath did an odd, useful thing. "I will," she said, "unless I'm here." Riva smiled. "You can be both. People are big enough for 2 rooms." They shepherded Jules home first. The gas station from the night before had replaced its fallen ice with an overstock, as if preparing to bribe fate should it return. Jules' boss blinked like a deer that had seen a car decide to be kind. Jules hugged Sorrel hard enough to rearrange a rib and whispered, "I'm going to take Python classes." Then she blushed, "Because I want to be the guy with the computer who makes the sprinklers turn on, not the one who slips in the puddle." Mara and Sorrel laughed, and both promised to send links that did not give money to people who didn't deserve it. They left Jules in a world that had not changed on the surface, which is where most worlds prefer to live. Next, Sorrel asked to stop by the diner. The bell above the door applauded like it had been practicing. Beryl looked up from a skillet and said, "There she is," in a tone could butter toast from across the room. Sorrel moved through her station, touching the coffee machine like a friend you almost lost. She swapped out a stack of cups that had been stacked with less dignity than she preferred, and the small ceremony of order returned oxygen to the morning. Two linemen slid into the corner booth, arguing about whether courage was good engineering or good luck. Sorrel poured coffee and let the sound ground her. When a man at the counter set a briefcase on the floor and rested his hand on it like a vow, she smiled to herself and poured him decaf. He drank it gratefully, and she didn't correct him, because some illusions are preventative medicine. Near 10, the bell tapped and she looked up reflexively, and then looked away, a technique learned from wild animals and women who prefer their hearts to stay inside their ribs. It was not Calder. It was a woman with hair like certainty, wearing a cardigan with elbow patches that suggested she'd read books that torched someone else's career. She took a stool, ordered tea with lemon, and cried quietly into a tuna melt. She refilled her napkin twice and did not make conversation. Compassion sometimes wears the shape of a person who can be trusted not to ask questions. When her shift ended, she wiped the last ring of sugar off table 7 like she was winding a music box. She looked at her phone. No messages from Mara. Good news wears silence. A single message from Lala. "You alive?" Sorrel texted back, "Yes. I carried an ice bucket like a weaponized wedding gift." Lale sent 20 knives and a son, which in their lexicon meant, "You terrify me, and I'm proud." Outside, the day decided to be generous. Sorrel walked the 4 blocks to her apartment and stopped at the stairwell fern to check its eccentric stubbornness. It had polished 2 new leaves while she'd been negotiating with men who believed nouns belonged to them. "Show off," she said, and watered it from a bottle that had wanted to be a soda once. Her door's lock turned the way locks do when they're not offended. Inside, the room was exactly as she'd left it, which she accepted as a benediction. She made tea, added honey, let the kettle ask its small question, and gave it the same answer she'd given last night. Yes. She sat on the couch, stared at the square of sky her window permitted, and felt the quiet come back not as an absence, but as a friend with groceries. The knock came at 5:12. It was not timid and not a demand. It was the kind of knock that believes in the person inside the door. Sorrel crossed the room, checked the peephole out of respect for yesterday's education, and saw a cap's brim, a mouth she recognized as thoughtful, and a pair of shoulders that carried miles like a tattoo. She opened the door. Calder Pike stood in the hallway, smaller than a truck and larger than an apology. He held a paper bag under one arm, folded at the top with the kind of care reserved for whatever had taught him not to spill. His eyes, gray, tired, alive, did that thing where they made the world vowed to behave. "Hey," he said, like a person who had practiced hello until it meant I survived. "Hi," Sorrel said, because some words improve when you refuse to upgrade them. They looked. That was the conversation first. Then Calder lifted the bag a little, the way people present offerings to gods who might be hungry. He asked, "Trade?"
Sorrel laughed, delighted and startled by the sound of it in her own mouth. "Always," she said. She accepted the bag. Inside,
apples, rolls, a tiny jar of jam that had never met a supermarket. "You had a day," Calder said, not a question. "You had several," she answered. He tipped his head, admitting both. "I wanted to say thank you, not just for the food." He looked down the hallway, then back. "They say I do this alone," he said. "That's the myth because it makes the people who should care less guilty, but I don't. I'm carried. By people who hold doors and pour coffee and say turn left when the road pretends there's only right." She felt heat behind her eyes and decided not to negotiate it away. "It was 2 apples and some rolls," she said, and both of them knew she was lying about quantity. "And a voice," he said, "which is heavier." They stepped into the room, which had the decency to keep its opinions to itself. Sorrel poured tea, because tea was an arrow that always found a target. Calder held the cup with the same 2 hands that had held her diner's coffee like it was winter. He drank. He looked around like a person who had been lost in larger spaces and was grateful to find edges again. "What happens now?" Sorrel asked. "In your map. I keep driving, until people with louder microphones are done saying the things I can't. Then I take something small somewhere that doesn't like to be watched. Then I sleep in a place without a name." "And you?" he asked, a question that surprised them both. Sorrel considered the key in her pocket, the card with the faint number, the diner's bell, the fern's arrogance. "I go back to work, and sometimes I don't. I think I might be available for part-time shorelines." He smiled back, the kind that doesn't perform, only exists. "Good coast," he said. They talked, the way people do when they know time is rationed. About sisters who send knives and sons, about trucks that learn the smell of mountains, about the science of pie crust and the geometry of guilt. Calder said nothing about what exactly had changed hands in a park while pigeons rewrote a budget. Sorrel asked nothing, and in the spaces where questions might have lived, trust did instead. When he stood to go, dusk had arranged itself carefully along the windowsill. "Thank you," he said again. And this time the word felt like it had built itself a chair and sat down inside the room. "Be careful," she said. "And when you can't be careful, be lucky." He laughed quietly. "Luck likes people who carry ice buckets," he said, and tipped his cap. He hesitated. "May I—" He gestured at the doorframe, the hallway beyond, the complicated future. "May I come back and tell you when the microphone stops shouting? You may come back and tell me when the coffee tastes like victory." He nodded, like a man making a contract with something he respected. He left. The hallway received him with the same neutrality it gave to everyone, which is a kind of grace. Sorrel stood for a minute holding the doorframe the way people hold each other when they need a fact. Then she closed the door, leaned her forehead against it in the ritual of those who've re-entered their own lives, and breathed. The next morning, news trucks bullied the curb outside the corporate headquarters of a company that had mistaken people for paper. Commentators practiced outrage while interns did the math. A journalist in Sacramento went on air with eyes that said sleep later and words that said names now. At the diner, Sorrel poured coffee for a table of road workers who were 3 jokes into a day they'd end with sore shoulders and no regrets. She slid a slice of pie to the woman in the cardigan and elbow patches when the tears returned but the appetite had not. And the woman laughed through salt and said, "You're more dangerous than the news." At noon, a man with a clipboard came in and tried to sell the owner a package that would guarantee protection against lawsuits. Sorrel looked at him for exactly 1 beat too long, and the man decided another restaurant needed him more. At 2, Mara Devine appeared at the counter like a sentence that had been waiting for punctuation. She ordered coffee. Sorrel poured it. "You good?" Mara asked. "Good enough to pay rent," Sorrel said, And to keep a bag under the counter for the people headed west. Keep doing that, Mara said. She slid an envelope across the counter. Not money, papers. A new lock. A camera that worked. The correct kind of ink. Reimbursements, she said, deadpan. And Sorrel let her get away with it. Tell Riva the photographs helped. They made the room behave. I will, Mara said. She finished her coffee, left cash, and an apology to the bell for not applauding. It deserved better surprises. Days stretched. Nights negotiated. Jules sent photos from a coding class with a caption that read, "Learning to convince sprinklers to betray rich men." Riva mailed a postcard of a rocky coast. On the back, a single word, hold. A week later, at 9:13 a.m., exactly 2 minutes after Sora wiped the last sugar ring off table 7, the bell applauded. Calder Pike sat at the booth by the window and looked at the city like it had decided to make sense, one building at a time. Sorrel poured coffee. He cradled the cup in both hands as if winter might return any second. What's good when you have to be nowhere for a whole day and want to pretend time is a place? Pie, she said, and something with protein. He nodded. She wrote down what he hadn't asked for and added an extra egg without charging, because some rituals become vows. When she brought the skillet, he said, "They're going to argue about me on the news for a year and then forget. The people they hurt might not." "We'll remember," Sorrel said. "We're inconvenient like that." He smiled at the window's reflection, and at her, and at a future he wasn't obligated to believe in, but did anyway. They ate and spoke about maps and weather, and the way apples are small, portable mercies. Midway through his second cup, his shoulders did the thing people's shoulders do when they finally admit the chair is real. Outside, the city behaved, which was the most anyone could ask. Inside, the diner's clock ticked. No longer a weapon, but simply an instrument. Sora looked at Calder and thought, not for the first time, that some stories don't end. They expand into rooms where more people fit. She thought of the shoreline photographs, of how water keeps trying, and the land keeps standing, and both are right if you choose your day. The bell tapped again. Life entered on cue. Sora moved, balancing plates like decisions and kindness like contraband that had finally been legalized. The booth by the window stayed occupied by a man who carried miles and admitted hunger. The counter hosted a woman who would cry again next Tuesday, and a briefcase who needed decaf. The fern in the stairwell would make 2 more leaves before winter. Lale would send knives and a son, and then call, breathing the particular love of those far away and stubborn. When Calder stood to go, he left a folded bill, large enough to embarrass both of them, and a note that said, "Turn left even when the mat laughs." She pocketed the note, not the bill, and followed him to the door. She said, "Be water when you need to be. Be land when they forget to be careful." He tipped his cap. He said, "Be pie," and she laughed again, which meant certain kinds of weather had lost. In the months that followed, Sorrel split her time between the diner and a room with photographs of coasts. She learned how to hold a microphone steady when the air argued, how to say turn left in 5 different ways to 5 different kinds of fear, how to tell a teenager that the world should be big enough for her and then help make one corner of it so. She kept a paper bag under the counter with apples and extra rolls. She kept a card in her pocket with a number so faint you had to believe it to dial it. She kept her door's lock oiled and a kettle ready to ask small questions she could always answer. Some nights, when trucks ghosted past the diner windows and the highway turned gold,
She thought of a man who carried things that shouldn't exist, and the people who wanted him to stop. She thought of a black SUV that blocked a street, and a woman who knocked with a voice like weather, and the teenager who found out she could be a fox and a coder. She thought of water and land, and where they meet, how they both take turns telling the world what shape to be. And when she boxed a slice of pie for a driver headed west, she wrote on the lid, "Take the service road behind the orange cones. They forgot to measure their own shadow." No one ever asked her what it meant. The ones who needed it understood. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.